So I've refined my ZBrush over the last 10 plus years in the games industry. You don't have that kind of time, so I'm going to go through all my optimizations, and at the end you can download all my menu and UI settings. In this video I'll show you how to speed up your ZBrush software, tips and tricks for saving time in your workflows, and I'll also go through my hotkeys, UIs and menu systems. Lots of hidden gems and information in this one, so you definitely want to use the chapters. Hi guys, it's Virtus here. I'm a 3D character artist, games art director and university lecturer. My expertise lies in forging game industry artists. After this video you can download all of it free, including an instructional PDF and additional tips to go along with that. First thing you want to do is get rid of all the annoying pop-ups that come up. It's really important because when you're working on a project you obviously want to be practicing and saving a lot of time. So we're going to make loads of changes that's going to optimize that sort of workflow. So whenever you open ZBrush, you'll be met by this home page. Sometimes can be some useful stuff. I'm not usually interested in it. Instead, you can change this setting to show if updated. After you close that, you'll always be met by the lightbox as well. So the lightbox can be useful if you preload some projects in there. So say, for example, if it's a cube or a sphere you like to start from. If you don't like doing that, you can press tab to close it. But even better than that, you can just have it not load up when you first start. So if you go into the preferences and then under lightbox, you can tick the button that says open at launch. You want to untick that. So while we're in here, there's a couple of more optimizations you can do. So say you're working on a larger portfolio piece and you're always opening the same project, you're not jumping around, which is highly suggestible. If you come into startup, you can auto reload the recent project. So that can be very useful. Just something that I change is the screensaver. I don't know why, I find it really annoying that I can't see my work from a distance if I'm taking a break and some other person's work pops up, so I usually turn that off. And one of the most annoying things that ZBrush does, I don't know why they do it, but when you first load it up and close it starts to fade in and fade out. If you're like me, you like to open things really quickly and change away. So under interface, you go into MISC, you can turn the fade in duration down to 0. So it's instant. Okay, so you're probably one of two things. You don't know how to enable customization or change your hotkeys, or you've already got the files and want to load those up. So I'm going to show those now. If you already know that, just skip ahead a little tiny bit, but there's still some useful information here. So under preferences, we can always initialize ZBrush. That's going to take it back to its default. If you hold shift, we're going to open config. We're also going to open hotkeys. So if you ever want to make an edit to your UI system, we're going to enable this button, which is enable customization. It's a really useful button. So a little trick that I do is I actually drag that off onto my home page because I'm always using it. I'm always changing the brushes that I'm using. So if you hold Control and Alt, you can click this button and then just drag it onto your main screen, put that wherever you want. Whenever you make an edit, you'll basically come out of this and then you'll press the Store Config button, and that's going to store it into your PC. Now we're going to load the files that I've sent out to everyone. So under config, you go into load config, find Virtus custom UI and then press open. We're also going to load up the hotkeys. So in preferences, hotkeys, load, and then find the same hotkey text document and then press open. So what I actually do is I also tear this store config off and just put it above. Now what that allows me to do, say if I come to the brushes, these are the commonly used brushes that I've used in this open project. Hold Control and Alt, I can bring in things like Move, Clay, IMMs. Once I'm happy with that, I can then just come out of Enable Customization on my home page and then tap the Store Config. So you'll see you can really quickly personalize your ZBrush on the fly instead of opening up all these menu systems, which can be very useful. So usually what people do when they first start out, when I'm teaching at university, they'll put their most commonly used brushes in the bottom panel just because they're getting used to it. That's kind of like the first stage of optimization. Second stage is actually assigning those to hotkeys, so you can be a lot faster. So to assign a hotkey, you'll see there's no sort of enable hotkeys button. It's actually assigned to a hotkey itself. So say we want to put the clay brush on 3 on the number pad. I'm going to make sure I'm out of UI customization. I'm going to hold Control and Alt and I'm going to tap on the clay brush once. You'll see in the top left it's changed and it says press any key combination assigned to the custom hotkey. So I'm going to let go of everything on my keyboard and then just press the number 3. Now you'll see whenever I want to change that, I can just press 3 and it automatically goes. So really quickly you can set up a list of hotkeys depending on the project that you're working on, change the brushes out and things like that. Okay, so I've loaded up a project here. It's something we did on a live stream, so you can check that out. I'll put it in a link below. But usually what I do in terms of the color in the background, I don't like the gradient because it's going to hide shadows. It's also going to hide highlights depending on where it is on the screen. So if you want to change that, if you come into documents and then under rate, you can turn this down to 0. It's going to get rid of the gradient. So while we're here, we're also going to change the color of the background. I usually go for something a little bit darker and then have my subject as sort of like a medium gray. So to do that, you can go to the left and in color. And then on the second color, we can turn that to something that's a little bit more dark. Come back into the documents and then click this back button. That's basically going to change the color of the background depending on what you've selected. Also, whenever you load up a ZBrush file, it usually comes in as this basic red default material. No one uses it. I don't know who uses it. They must be crazy, but usually people use the basic material. If you want to set that as default, come into material, dock that to the side, and then click on the main material. Then you're going to have a save as startup material. This can be cool. You can create your own sort of saves, or maybe something that's more fitting to your own preferences. Usually I put a very small rim light just to separate the subject from the background. So here I'm going to talk about how I like to use ZBrush and think about ZBrush. So I use a lot of space, and everything in my vicinity is something that I use a lot. If it's really common, it's usually on a hotkey. So whenever I'm moving about and I want to bring up some menu systems, I usually press space. So anything that's found in here, it's unlikely to be found on the side buttons because I can always access it here. In terms of the canvas, sometimes if you move in so far, usually this outer border can be useful to rotate around. You'll see that the icon changes from painting to moving. Now that might be misshaped or missized based on your computer screen. So if you want to reset it, if you go into the documents, then under new document with W size selected, you can press new document. Documents haven't been changed, that's fine. We're going to keep our project there. Press no, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to resize to your screen space. So basically if you change the size of this window, you can always come back to documents and resize everything. Remember that you're working with a tool, so we have to redraw this and then come back in again. You'll know it's be effective because the border is perfectly the size of your window. So whenever you're masking in ZBrush, sometimes it can be tempting to come into the brushes and then change the mask in these settings. A useful trick that you can do is if you hold Control and then click the button up here, you're only going to get a selection of anything that's under the Control key. So for example, a mask lasso can be useful if you want to select something or mask it off. And the same is basically true for Control and Shift. So Control and Shift is usually a selection lasso or a selection box, and that means you can focus down on one single area. But you can also have some different options in here, so you can change it to a trim or a knife lasso. And because I know they can all be accessed here, again, it's not something that I'm going to assign to the side or waste time with it. If I want to select it, I know that I can always come up to this section here depending on the key that I'm selecting. So not many people know there's a little hidden lower section down here. So if you press that, that's going to open a new window. I find that really useful, say I'm working on some environment projects or a hard surface sci-fi, a brush that I don't use so often. I'll basically select those brushes, enable customization like we did up here, and then I'll just drag those very specific brushes that I don't use too often down to this bottom section. So say I have this selection there. It's not usually something I save because I don't want it to be there permanently, but very usefully I can select a very specific sort of brush there. Something that's even more useful for that, and it's what I use most often, is something called XMD Tool Box. So I should go over this in more detail in a video on professional tips. Basically, I'll link that also below. But this is really useful because you can actually categorize the brushes that you've selected and collected. So say for example, if you're working on stone, you can tab those and put them in folders and sort of name them and tag them and find them on all independently. You can also favorite ones that you use often. So that's really useful. It does hook in nicely into ZBrush, and then you can select your brushes there. Maybe you've got a second screen, you can have that off to the side. So with ZBrush, it's all about not wasting time. There's a lot of options in here. I always joke around that it's like a bit of an Excel spreadsheet. So if there's something that's commonly used, I'll ideally assign it to a custom pop-up. The nice thing is you can also assign that to a hotkey so it pops up, and then you can select it really close to your mouse and also to what you're sculpting. So I'll show you how to make that in a moment. Whenever I'm saving, I usually don't come into the save as or the file projects. I just press 9 on the keyboard, and that's going to automatically save it to a directory. When the autosaves do pop up, if you don't want it, I usually just smash escape, and that's going to cancel it. So that's another way to really speed up your workflow and efficiency. Okay, so now I'm going to go through the list of hotkeys, things that I use most when I'm sculpting certain subjects. So some people really refrain from using hotkeys. It's really super important. If you think about any sort of professional gamer, their reaction speed is based on what sort of hotkeys they have assigned. I remember I used to play World of Warcraft, and buttons like execute to kill someone really quickly under 20%. That was really close to one of my fingers. And you usually find with a lot of games that that's the case. So it's exactly the same when you're in artistic programs like ZBrush. You really want to remove the lag time between your creativity and what you want to do. Super important to get used to hotkeys and also customize them towards yourself. So I'm going to talk you through all the decisions that I made in terms of how I'm sculpting. And you'll also pick up a lot of useful brushes that are commonly used. So starting from the top, in the top left is the tilde key. It's usually the one that's next to 1. I don't know if it's on your guys' computers. What that's going to do is basically activate and deactivate Sculptris Pro. You'll know that you're in Sculptris Pro because this purple turns up. So if you're unfamiliar with Sculptris Pro, what it does is it creates resolution based on the size of your brush. So say for example you want to put in some more details, say with a dam standard. it's automatically going to generate the geometry where you've painted. And it's the same for smoothing. So say, for example, you want to get rid of details with Sculptris Pro, it's going to lower the resolution. So that can be really good when you're concepting, but for me, I often hop in and out of it. So basically, I can come in, use normal functions and not changing the geometry, press the tilde key, and now I'm suddenly changing the geometry. Sculptris Pro can be really useful for actually fixing geometry as well. Like say you got some jagged edges or you want to open some holes up. Next notable entry, I press Ctrl and 1, and that's basically going to solo or isolate whatever subtool I'm working on. That's aligned to Maya as well. So Ctrl and 1 is also going to do the same thing. So I like those to be on a slight overlap. Key 1, I have reducing the brush size, and key 2, I have increasing the brush size. That's something that I'm just used to in Photoshop. Last thing I want to be doing is doing multiple keystrokes to basically change my brush strike. I want that to be like a fluid and dynamic process, so it's all assigned to my left hand. If you want to assign that for yourself, come into Z plugins. It's always hidden like Pixologic always does, and under brushes you've got brush down and brush up. So if you hold Control and Alt, you can actually assign that to a hotkey, and it's very useful. Or I usually assign to a custom camera, so something I go over in other videos, but very quickly under Documents, you can open the Z App Link properties. You can basically assign the front camera, lock it in, and then assign that to a key. I usually assign it to 4. So say for example you're moving around and then suddenly you want to snap back to that camera, I just press 4 and then it locks back. Really good if you're doing thumbnails or you've got a very specific view that you're going through on your portfolio. I use Q for clay. So clay's a really good brush for organics. Gives this soft fill-in surface. It's also really good for bridging gaps and things like that. Way better than the standard brush. W is another top shelfer, so this is the move brush. So it's for use for changing form. Say you want to change the structure or the shape of something, or the silhouettes. That's going to be used quite often. Probably my second most used brush. E is dam standard. So dam standard is really useful for detailing and also separating some forms. So say for example you can go with a dam standard, come back to clay and then start to build on top of that. Shift and E is very similar to dam standard, so I changed that to a pinch brush. So pinch is just what it does, it pinches surfaces together. The dam standard brush actually inserts and then pinches afterwards. That's why I basically couple them on the same key. Shift and W I use for move topological. So W is move and then Shift W is move topological. Really useful if you have a subtool that's got multiple components to it. So if I press Shift F, it shows us the polygroups. And then with the move topological, it's only going to move the first thing that is touched. Now with the normal move brush, it's going to move everything together. So just switching between those two, you can get a lot of power and functionality for moving things about. R is my standard brush, and then Shift R is going to be the paint version of that. So the paint version of standard is the normal standard brush without the Z add and then RGB ticked on. So really good for painting really quickly. A is assigned to clay tubes. Sometimes people use clay buildup. I just prefer clay tubes because it's a bit more organic. Really good for building up structure really quickly. Say for example you need a lot of mass, then you can use the clay tubes. S I assign to trim dynamic. So this is for etching down any sort of like form and function that you put in. Really good for shaping the planes of the face. If you're working on hard surface, like in a couple of videos that we've done, we use the trim dynamic to just etch away the surface and then couple that up with an H polish. So with H polish, I also assign that to Shift and S. So on the same key. And what H polish does is basically going to refine that surface. It's really good for sharpening edges, super good for hard surface. Also the starts of creating the structure inside of a face. The Z key I usually assign to something that's custom in the moment. So say for example, I'm working on hair, I might be using the snake hooks. So instead of coming into the brush and using snake hook all the time, I'll basically use Z as my sort of like custom hotkey. So as I'm working on hair, I'll just hold Control and Alt, click the snake hook, and then I'll click my custom key, which would be Z. So this will change all the time depending on what project I'm doing or what I'm very specifically working on at the time. Remember with snake hook, you want to have Sculptris Pro activated so it draws out geometry. So again, I'll come back to the tilde key and then I can very quickly just concept some hair. So now I'm going to show you how to make this custom pop-up menu. So what I use it for is just these very commonly used brushes like the IMM primitive. And that's really useful if I'm at the start of a character or a creature. I can basically use these capsules to really quickly create some form. There'll be some other useful stuff in here like auto grouping or very quickly splitting and masking stuff. So this is all found in geometry and subtool and split and merge and all that sort of stuff. But I just like to have it on hand. So say for example, we want to split this hair, I'll just get the lasso and then I'll come into 3 and then I can split this mask point into a separate subtool, and then I'll also have different options in terms of merging. So I'll go over this more detail with one of the membership videos if you're interested. So now we're going to go into this sidebar. You'll often see a lot of artists really like to populate this area with every single button that they've ever used in their entire history. I really like to minimize it. So for example, if I don't use it too much, I'm just going to drag it off, or I'm going to make sure that it's assigned to a hotkey. So I really want to make this minimal. One real key feature of this is I do use it to see what is activated at a certain time. So say for example with the backface mask or a spotlight projection, these are toggleable buttons. So I really want to quickly see if I have a problem with one of my brushes, is my backface mask on, is spotlight projection on, and all these sorts of things that I can fix really quickly. I also assign a lot of materials to the side. So say for example with the outline material, that's really useful for finding silhouettes. Obviously I don't want to go into the menu system and find that. I want to visually see it just to the side so I can click it very quickly. Something like a flat color can be very useful for seeing the silhouettes and scales of thing. And the same with the skin shader if I start to paint stuff. Those are my most commonly used materials. What I'll usually couple that up with is by pressing tab. It just extends the size of the screen. You can also double tap these side sections. That's going to hide the menu systems. So if you're really getting engrossed with sculpting something, sometimes it's nice just to hide those selections. The benefit with that is if we press 3, it's obviously going to still allow us to open up this pop-up system. So if you get really engrossed, it's actually quite nice to close all this off and then fall back on your pop-up menu system for the most commonly used things and all the hotkeys that you've already got assigned. So when I'm teaching at university, I sometimes do that. It looks really impressive and it usually excites people to set up their own hotkeys and also their own pop-up menus. Some other options are just your standard things like solo and perspective. I have these hotkeys already. So for example, perspective is P and then solo is Control 1. But as I said, I do want to see if it is activated at that very time. And the same with Dynamesh. So I have a key for Dynameshing, but I do want to see if the currently selected tool has Dynamesh activated and also what sort of resolution I'm working at. So this is almost like a cockpit HUD where I can see a lot of things. This space below I'll usually use just as sort of like a very quick trash area. So if I'm using a button very often, I'll then drag it down to there. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to create this pop-up menu. So first we're going to enable Customize, come into Preferences and then open up the Custom UI. So under Custom UI, you're going to go Create New Menu. Under New Menu, you can name it anything. Then ZBrush, there's often certain workflows that you do a lot. Maybe it's like reprojecting details on. So usually what I'll do is I'll create a new menu for those sorts of workflows and processes, and I'll order them in a bit of a chronology, because when you're projecting something, all those buttons are hidden in different sides of the menu, different tabs. It's nice to have them all in one sort of space. So for this example, we can just say projection. You'll see that it creates a new tab up here. So with that tab, we can now press Control and Alt, click on it once, and then assign it to a hotkey. So I assign it to 3. I think usually you have to deactivate enable customization to be able to do those hotkeys. But first what we're going to do is going to show you how to fill this up. So in the preferences, if you dock this to the side, we're going to have access to a lot of useful menu systems and sub palettes. What I also do is I get the new menu system, I also dock that to the side as well. So basically with these selections, these are basically fillers. They don't show up when you're outside of customization. So say for projection, we can come and find some projection tools. So with our new projection menu, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this to the left side. And while we're still in customization, I'm going to find some very useful projection buttons. So for example, project tool I often use. And then what we're going to do is just basically drag that over to the left side. In the preferences, you've got a lot of options and useful buttons. So for example, custom sub palettes. Maybe there's different parts of the workflow that you can put in there. Something you often do when you're reprojecting is you duplicate an object, then you also delete the last one. So usually I just put duplicate in here, delete, and anything that's going to be necessary for that entire workflow. So here you can see the actual menu that I've made. It's Vertex, and now I've got things for posing that are often used. Detail, there's lots of different brushes in terms of flipping the alpha, changing the kind of alpha that's applied. I'll have lots of FBX import and export settings because sometimes they're scattered all over the place. I'll also have the reprojecting, so creating a new menu, Z remesher, changing the light system, and all sort of like rendering things. So this is really your opportunity to create it how you want. With the pop-up menu, I do like to keep it a little bit more compact so it's not getting in the way. So I usually put things in sub-tools and sub-headings so I can open and close those. So before I finish the video, I'm going to show you 2 more bonuses. There's a couple of things I want you to do first is definitely check out that reference video. It's super useful showing all the ways you can use references inside of ZBrush. Also download those projects, really good place to start from. Also got a breakdown, a PDF showing how to actually activate those hotkeys. It's useful to send off to other people. There's also loads of goodies inside of there in terms of read topology and a welcome package. I also want to hear what sort of custom UI systems you use for your workflows. It would be really interesting to see what other people are using and how they like to use ZBrush. So for the 2 bonuses, basically, many people know this, but under Z plugins and under Subtool Master, there's going to be loads and loads of useful little buttons in here. So they're great to drag off the side, whether it's like a fill, a merge, cloning folders and renaming them. Usually these processes take quite long by themselves, but in the Subtool Master, they're going to be really useful. The other thing that I usually leave to the end because it's not so useful is actually changing all the colors of the buttons and stuff. And the only thing that I do is change the buttons from orange to blue. So in preferences under color, you can change everything in here and refine it to your liking. To be honest, the only thing I play with is the button colors and then maybe a little bit of opacity and stuff, but you can experiment and see how you get on. That's pretty much everything that I've gone over in terms of how I've edited my ZBrush over the last 10 years. I did go through a phase where I really stocked this up and had loads of buttons, loads of hotkeys. And then as time went on, I found out what was really useful, what was good for my workflow, and then refined it down, even to the extent where I was getting rid of the move tool. Always got to remember that with ZBrush, it's not about all the different sort of tools that you're using. You can pretty much make anything with a very few select of brushes. So say for example with mine, I've only got 4 on the top row and then slightly edited versions of that. So with that, you can completely make anything that you want. Customizing all these things is a really personal choice. So maybe you don't like something, you can change it out, and as you develop as an artist, things are going to change anyway. So it's nice to have that enable customization and store config up at the top so you can quickly change things. Also might be different on what you're working on, whether it's like metal, hairs. So follow the download link for my own personal setup that I'm sending out to everyone. You can work from that or change it and edit it, or just use a test out. You can always refer back to the initial default settings or preload your other one. It's just nice to see how other artists are working. So hopefully that's inspired you to create your own custom hotkeys. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.